Today's sponsor is Squared Up. They believe IT ops dashboards aren't dead, they just need to get a whole lot smarter.
Packet pushers.
Hello and welcome to Day 2 Cloud, you amazing humans. Today we talk to Sal Furino, a reliability engineer at Bloomberg, about what SLOs are, where they come from, and what you should be measuring, which is namely absolutely everything. Ned, what stood out to you today?
Well, Kyler, what's important is that we shouldn't be measuring everything. We need to be more decisive and thoughtful about what we're measuring because you can't measure everything. So you have to make some decisions. And where do you get the information for those decisions? Well, that's kind of what Sal brings to the table.
And let's go find out. With no further ado, let's get talking to Sal. Sal, thank you so much for joining us. Usually we do some level setting with who you are and what you do, and I'd love to do that. But first, I just want to contextualize this. We found you on LinkedIn posting about SLOs and SLAs and metrics and observability, and I am so curious about all that because I know nothing. I know nothing about this, and I want to know stuff. I want to know what you know. So first of all, who are you and what do you do?
Thanks for the introduction, Tyler. I work in the reliability engineering department at Bloomberg right now. Before joining Bloomberg, I worked for a couple startups and other financial institutions. And a lot of my passion in the past few years has been around reliability. When the SRE book came out in 2016 and I read it, it was kind of like the proverbial like eureka, like apple falling on your head kind of idea of, oh, hey, this is how you should manage systems at scale. Given my background in mathematics, I naturally gravitated to learning about metrics and observability and SLOs. And that's kind of something I've been focusing on exclusively for pretty much the past 3-ish years now.
I don't want to totally derail the conversation, but this background in mathematics, I'm so curious. When you say that, were you doing like particle physics or like statistical analysis? Like, what was that background?
I have a bachelor's in applied math with concentrations in computer science and chemistry from Marist College. I also had like a minor in information technology and systems. It sounds like I had 4 majors, but I really just liked computers and math and science. And I got to find a program to facilitate those needs. So
that is a fantastic background for particularly, as I understand it, like SRE stuff, statistics. I can see why you would marry those together, but I think I'm jumping the shark a little. So let's talk about what those are. So what is an SLO? Like, let's just set the context for the discussion.
So I actually think we have to back up a little bit there first. Before talking about what an SLO is, we have to talk about what is reliability. Because like SLOs are supposed to be this framework for talking about reliability. And I think we should have a good definition of what that is first before talking about them. The practice of reliability as a whole, in my mind, is like this hyper focus on customer anxiety. When you think about people like running services and so forth, and you're starting to measure things and taking metrics, it's a lot of what's the customer experiencing? Is our service and things we're providing healthy? And I kind of feel like the best metrics for SLOs for measuring reliability as a whole are metrics that revolve around creating proxies for the customer user experience of those services. Pretend like none of us are engineers or work in tech at all. We're just regular Joe Schmo. We're at a computer doing whatever, buying something on some e-commerce website. At the end of the day, you don't care what the CPU utilization is or the disk I/O or anything like that. You just want to get the thing quickly and we can get what you want done accomplished. It's what do I want to do? And I think that's something a lot of engineers and folks have to kind of, at the end of the day, take a step back and really think about what do they want? What do customers, users depend upon us or the service to help them be successful? What are they trying to accomplish? Naturally, we also need to be concerned about like some of their expectations. If we start talking about, hey, once we start talking about the what, we have to think about the how or how much. This is something that is kind of maybe hard to come by for some folks, especially if you're new to observability or SLOs or thinking about what are proper objectives. It's going to be hard to kind of pinpoint your finger on that at first. And we could get back to that a little bit. But something I feel like kind of industry-wide that has kind of changed is like with the prevalent of like B2C companies, business to consumer companies out there, the general baseline expectation for how services and things should function online, I think the bar has been risen so much. If we look at today versus, 10 years ago in 2014, things are a lot more snappier, more responsive. You're expecting it to not get an error screen when you try to like load a website or something like that, versus in 2008 or 2004, expectations were much lower. I feel like there's a global trend in technology that's prevalent of like business to consumer technologies. People are also expecting that in business ones as well. And it's just become more pervasive throughout that. If you want to like also think about, besides like the timeline, you also think of what the application is. There's some things that might have a high expectation. Like if we think maybe some application that gives like financial market data out to the world might have higher expectations around it versus, your local restaurant down the street and their menu or their specials for the week. These are different things, are different reliability standards and also different expectations on how fast they would load and the interactions with that in a certain way. I know I just said like a whole bunch of stuff about reliability as a whole. Is there anything we want to talk about there before like I move on to like SLOs as a whole?
Oh my goodness, so many things.
So much.
You really you struck it home for me when it's all about the customer perspective, and that we've changed our level of expectation. 10 years ago, I would expect my local restaurant to have a website, just a website, maybe a menu on it, but that's it, right? Now I expect it to not only have a menu on a website, but also allow me to order food from that restaurant and have it happen quickly and have the payment process be very smooth and for it to remember my details and stuff like that. So the expectation I have just for the local pizzeria down the street has risen dramatically. And that's true across basically any service that I use today. Is my expectations for performance and reliability have gone way up. And if I run into a bumpy, high friction interaction, I'm going to abandon that current attempt of using the site and I'm probably not going to come back to it.
But I also think potentially like some users have also been trained. Like if it's not working, oh, what do I first thing you do? Refresh the page. Let me try again and start over. There's like a certain amount of training some people have built into just because they have encountered reliability again and a certain awareness of technology. Maybe I'm also being a bit hopeful for like P50 user that's out there. But I think it's something that some people that have some reasonable expectations around technology might try off and do again. Like just because at the end of the day, people don't want to start over, yeah. But also if I abandon it and go someplace else, maybe if I've retried a couple times, I might abandon it altogether and try Pizza Place 2 down the street or something like that to try to get the same thing. Or hey, maybe I'm just feeling like tacos today. Who knows? There's a whole bunch of different reasons why people could abandon it, but reliability is, I think, a key thing. It's like a hidden feature that a lot of people don't talk about, but it's baked into our expectations of using things day to day. Even if you're at a restaurant, you expect like, oh, hey, I hope I get my soup faster than like a well-done steak or something. When you place an order, like there's still some baseline expectations there of just everyday services, even outside of technology.
Are reliability and performance the same thing, or are they vastly different or just slightly related?
I feel reliability is more so the goal or what you want to try to achieve. And I think performance is the actual. Like think of it like going back to like science class, the theory versus actual kind of thing. Like I think that's how performance and reliability kind of go hand in hand in my mind. I guess there's also sometimes when you're being overly performant, overly reliable. And that could be good, but you also could be setting yourself up for failure for when you do have a time when it is unreliable. So like there's definitely like pros and cons to it. I guess that's my hot take for performance and reliability.
So it sounds like consistency is key across all of it. Is if you're giving a certain level of reliability, you want that to be consistent when load increases or more people are using the site or whatever the thing is. Consistency is the main thing you're going after.
Correct. And I love how you mentioned like increased volume, but there's also another issue as well that's very similar when your system can no longer handle the load in which it had before. So you had like a degradation service. So it's a similar problem like, oh, hey, I'm unable to accomplish the load, whether it's the load organically growing or our ability to handle that load is shrinking. So like it's just two ways of viewing the same problem. What's the phrase? The knife cuts both ways type of deal.
Mhm.
So I feel like this is maybe a little bit of a softball question, but it's certainly a place that I start thinking about reliability is why can't I just have it always be up? Like, why do we not start with that? Or why do we start with that as a goal?
So, okay, sorry, a little triggering there. You can't have reliability. Well, maybe you can in some very unique circumstances of you have like an air gapped environment in which you don't push changes to and several layers of redundancy over and over again. But that seems like a very overproduced, like you need that for maybe more safety critical systems, stuff that, are more dependent upon things than, I don't know, other things that maybe don't matter around people's like lives or healthcare or stuff like that. Things that I kind of feel bad saying this, maybe not e-commerce or things like that, that maybe aren't as critical for safety for some folks, but maybe in some situations they are. I don't know. But at the end of the day, you can't always be 100% reliable to everybody all the time, everywhere. Like it's just not sustainable. Once you start accepting that, hey, why not 100%? You're going to have some errors there which are acceptable. And once you're able to get over that mental hurdle, you can then go off and saying, what's a certain amount of failure or unreliability in which our user or customer base can tolerate? And then once you start asking that question, you could start saying, how can I use this effectively? This is the amount of like allowed errors or allowed unreliability in which we can have. How can we spend this? Can we ship additional features? Can we maybe, some features that aren't fully baked? Maybe you do some like fancy like load balancer stuff and only put it out to 1% of your user base or something like that, just to test to see how it goes and then quickly roll it back. Maybe you want to do some chaos experiments to try to be more reliable in the future. Maybe you actually want to bank that error budget to save it because you have a big release coming up in 2 weeks. These are all just like different things. Once you have an idea or a concept of allowed errors, how can we use a degradation customer experience effectively? And I think that's when you start really changing the landscape of how you think about the reliability of your service, what the features product needs to ship, how engineering needs to support that, and how both of them end up supporting the end of the day business goals.
You just shifted my whole way of thinking about the problem. I feel like it was like total 180 because before I'm thinking of reliability as aspiring to 100%, but accepting less. And what you're saying is, no, no, don't think of it that way. You have a budget that's allocated for how unreliable your system can be, and you need to spend that budget effectively. That is such a mind shift. Like, I might need to sit for a few moments and just doing that.
Go off and do that, get a coffee or something. We could come back and get to it. Maybe if you're listening to the podcast right now, maybe hit pause, come back, let that bake in, and then come back to us. Do you guys run ads or something? Could we be like, run
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know. So let's get back to like the main topic of the episode, which is the idea of an SLO. I think we kind of have an idea around reliability now. So how does the SLO factor into what we're trying to do with reliability?
At the heart of it, SLOs are metrics around customer and user expectations. I think we've established that, for reliability. Most folks are generally familiar with the concept of like an SLA, which is something more contractual, that roughly states I'm service provider A and I need to provide a certain level of service for consumer B or other service thing there. SLAs are also more legally binding, and sometimes there's even like repercussions for them as well if you don't meet these expectations. People are generally familiar with SLAs if you've done some business online. Like if you have an ISP, you have an SLA for that. Good luck trying to get anything back from that. But, like there's different things there to ensure a certain level of service. Generally, when we talk about what are those, there's this concept of level of nines. And this is something we talk about in terms of for metrics. So there's like 99%, which is 99% of the time of transactions or time, or if we're talking about time slices there, we're trying to meet some adherence to some type of goal. This is 2 nines, you can say 2.5, which is 99.5, or 3 nines, 99.9, 4 nines, 99.99, etc. You get it. And this is something in which you have to talk about in terms of availability. Is the service, am I able to get a successful response from the service when I go and request from it? When the request processes, how long does it take? What's the latency for it? When I actually go forth and get information from it, do I get the correct information back? And then also as well, you have to think about when I go off to scale my service, this is more for the back end and the consumers, when I'm getting a high load for it, how do I actually scale it effectively? What's the saturation of the service across the infrastructure?
So you've talked a lot about error budgets and trying to knock down your downtime per year, increase your level of nines of uptime. And as I understand it, as you increase those nines, it just gets more and more expensive to knock down those nines and increase your uptime. How do you pitch that to leadership? How do you say, like, I need 20 grand a year for us to stay up for another 20 minutes a year? Like, that's such a huge amount of money for such a short amount of time. Is it all about risk in the same way that information security is measuring vulnerabilities versus risk? How do you frame that up when you ask for so much money for so little time from leadership?
The short answer is it depends, which is like the cop-out answer for pretty much anything. If you're going to spend an additional 20 grand, how much more do we expect to get on that return? Oh, hey, 20 grand for an extra 20 minutes of uptime. I think it was the initial proposition you put forward. So can we expect to get an additional 50,000 in revenue from that? Also, when are those 20 minutes out of the year is an important thing to ask as well. Let's say we're an e-commerce site, and if that 20 minutes is during Black Friday, that could be a difference between 50 grand and maybe $500,000, versus if it's like on a random like 4 a.m. on Saturday throughout the year, I don't know, April 15th or something out of the year. That's tax day. I don't know why I picked that. But anyway, some random midnight or off hour, for an extra 20 minutes of downtime, that's not really giving the business much. I think it's important to contextualize it. Oh, hey, not just how much more reliable do we need to be, but when do we have to do it in order to match our business goals and customer expectations of when they'll be using the service. Maybe, I don't know, you're a concert venue and someone just did like a farewell tour and you want to sell like tickets for the next show. Maybe you want to be really available after they just did a show or something like in New York and someone wants to get the tickets for Philly. Maybe you need to be really available after that. I don't know. It all depends to matching when you need to be reliable.
I think that's a great point. I'm finally catching up to where Ned was earlier in the show, where you're just flipping my mind backwards. I think of risk as something that comes and bites me. My server blew up. I have a power surge. That layer of services went down. But really, our error budget needs to include the stuff that's planned too, upgrades and planned maintenance and things like that. So that's really interesting that you can plan for that downtime to when it's least costly to your business. That's an interesting way to think about risk.
Yeah, and I don't think that's like a novel concept either. Like for someone who's like has a background being like a sysadmin and a program and stuff like that, like we always scheduled upgrades for off hours or off peaks or when people wouldn't be using the systems. A few jobs ago, like I worked for a credit union and I was in the IT department for them. We did upgrades like computers when the branch was closed. We wouldn't do that while members and stuff were there. This core upgrades and stuff like that we scheduled during holiday weekends that people generally wouldn't be using the system that much at that time. This is kind of like having planned downtime or trying to figure out when to do it so it doesn't impact your customer user base is important, but I think it's still something to bring forward into mind of trying to an idea of when to spend the error budget, when does it make sense to, especially when we start thinking about different ways to calculate error budgets a bit. There's kind of like two different ways in which error budgets are calculated. There's an idea around occurrences or time slices. Occurrences, if it's a straight up like, oh, hey, here's like a bunch of events that are happening or streams, how many good or bad events are we having at this time? Versus time slices is a different approach of breaking out the time into different windows and saying, oh, hey, for this minute, was it good or bad? How many percent of our transactions were successful during this minute? So we could count the minute as good or the minute as bad and then move on. How many good and bad minutes do we have out of the day? Boom, here's how much of our error budget we have put together for that time window. This could be like one day, a week, a month, whatever, just trying to get that in place.
Whenever I've been involved in calculating uptime versus downtime, one of the things we always took into account was planned maintenance. And that didn't count necessarily against your unplanned downtime because that was more of a crisis event where something blew up and you had to take care of it. And then I think it's interesting you're saying that may have happened, but if that happened on a random Tuesday at 2 a.m. and no one was using the system, then the cost of that unplanned downtime is very low. But if that happened on a really high traffic, middle of the day, and you've got tons of people waiting on the service, then that's a very expensive amount of downtime. So factoring that into your equation is going to be pretty important when you're figuring out how do I budget for, additional equipment or services or reliability factors to prevent that kind of downtime versus my 2 a.m. sort of issues.
Those are completely different scenarios, but they also burn your error budget at the end of the day, and it's trying to think about when it's impactful or not. You also could just get stormed, like you could just all of a sudden, for no rhyme or reason, you can't plan for it, but you still have an event that takes down your services. These things happen. I'm not coming at this from a security standpoint. I'm coming at it more of like, you went viral, let's talk about the happy path. Like things went really well. And that's kind of what happens. You have to be able to accommodate that load, at least in some way to help mitigate it. Now, when we start talking about like unexpected things like that, I generally give people a bunch of leeway. Like if, let's say, especially if they're new to SLOs and new to like picking and refining an objective, maybe you're off by like an order of magnitude. So let's say you think the service needs to be, let's call it 3 nines of reliability, right? But at the end of the day, you find yourself in a situation where you really need like 1 or 5 nines, you probably guessed wrong. That it wasn't really an educated guess. Like if you think you need 3 and you ended up at 2 or 4, oh, hey, you made a pretty good effort and you're close to it. Otherwise, like you could end up really over-engineering or under-engineering your solutions.
A lot of this is sort of applied theory, which is very interesting. I'm curious, does any of that change based on the technology? So if there's like EC2 with load balancers versus Kubernetes, does that change any of the methodologies or how you think about the world in terms of reliability and SLOs? Or is it the exact same stuff, just applied to a different service?
I'm going to answer that, but at first I want to give a little bit better definition of what an SLO is. So SLOs are kind of made up of 4 components. They're made up of an SLI, which is like a metric or some general query or a stream of data about what's happening with the service. This is our expectation of customer experience or some proxy for it. Then there's an objective. This is the value that's important for the underlying metric. So this could be latency has to be less than 500 milliseconds, or we need 90% of our requests have to be valid, whatever. Then you have our target, which is how often the objective has to be met. This is the level of nines we spoke to a bit earlier. And then we have the time window. What time period are we talking about here? So this could be, rolling 1 hour, 24-hour windows. If you counterline 1 day or rolling days, maybe something aligned to a sprint, like 14 days, 2 weeks about, or maybe something monthly or quarterly, whatever. You have different time windows of how often the objective has to be met for a certain period of time. All that comes together to brings us to our error budget. When we talk about all these things, notice how I didn't mention a single thing about technology. At the end of the day, it kind of doesn't matter. We're talking all about this theory. As long as you can instrument that service or that piece of technology you're using with different observability data, then you could apply an SLO to it. I'm not going to say it's going to be a good SLO or one that's going to provide value or something that matches the customer, but you might get some proxy for it there. Like if we're measuring like requests at the load balancer versus requests on an end server, those could both be equally valid based upon the use case, depending upon the scale of your service. If you're globally distributed in like 3 different regions, of course you want to measure it at the load balancer. That's where stuff's going to be happening. That's where you first receive the request. Versus if you don't have that capability and you're maybe like a smaller shop or something, oh, hey, maybe we have to go further down the line. We have to go closer to our hardware when we actually receive things and so forth. I'm sorry to give a cop-out answer, but it kind of depends where to start measuring things. But at the end of the day, SLOs are like this beautifully variable thing that can be applied to so many different scenarios, like even outside of technology. Like you could have it for a restaurant queue or how often the subway should come, or there's so many different expectations baked into your day-to-day life of using SLOs and trying to meet a certain level of service and so forth. Like you'd also say the same thing for like relationships with like your friends. Every friend group has that like one friend that is always late, so that this is where like you have to start measuring those expectations of what is there. Ned, that title?
That I might have that title occasionally.
Like we all have these baselines expectations on, hey, what's the experience going to be like interacting with this person or with this service or with this other thing we're doing. They can measure and make it so well. Let's take Ned being on time for an example here, right? If Ned started showing up more and more on time, your friend's going to start being like, hey, what's going on? Or just kind of taking and be happy, versus if you start being late again. Or maybe Kyler, if you start all of a sudden being late for a bunch of events and you're usually very on time or even early, or your friends can be like, hey, what's going on? Is everything okay? Like there's going to be a check-in. There's going to be that reevaluation of expectations there that generally happen. And I think those are kind of like SLOs an everyday experience type approach that people live with and don't even know they're doing math in their head.
When people say, I need a dashboard, what they're really saying is, show me the data. No organization in the world has moved beyond the need to use data to make informed decisions. The challenge today is that the old way of delivering that data is slow, and views are typically static. Data today is distributed across SaaS tools, data lakes, and a whole host of other places, and it's not necessarily stored with anything resembling structure. We need next generation tools that can cater to the reality that data comes from everywhere, and that's just what Squared Up is doing. You can find out more by going to squaredup.com for simple, awesome dashboards for total visibility. One of the key things that you've mentioned there a whole bunch of times is that we need to be able to measure it. If you can't measure it, then you can't set an objective around it. And that's, being able to collect a particular metric or, some other value from the system. And I guess that's one of the ways that technology actually has transformed and improved the ability to measure all these things. The more we instrument our systems, both the infrastructure and the applications, the more information we can draw from them and measure. But of course, that also means you could have information overload and not know what to measure properly.
That is a problem that happens at times. Let's start talking about implementing SLOs a bit here. So
okay,
you can measure everything and set up a whole bunch of SLOs on it, but I think those are going to be not providing the best value possible. So generally, when I start talking to teams about implementing SLOs and so forth, I start with the product team. Hey, what are the customer user journeys? What are the ways in which people are using this system? One question I love to ask product team is be like, demo me your product. What are the first few things you show me? Because I've been assuming these are the most important things in which are important towards it. And then I help work them through like, oh, hey, how often does this need to function correctly? How long should these things take? I ask them those type of questions to start pulling out the ideas and details of what should the expectation be? What is, because this product should represent the customer and they should reasonably have a good idea of what the user journeys are and what important metrics are. I'm willing to bet like products sometimes when they say, hey, I don't know what an SLO should be for this. Like you have metrics you're reporting up to somebody. Come on, let's get started. What are some of the KPIs that are important for this? Let's start there and start spitballing and trying to figure out what's actually there. Then after that, we kind of have like this engineering team. They're responsible for meeting the reliability goals and then also instrumenting it. This is where I'm tying back into your question, Ned, what actually should be instrumented. And this is where like product and engineering need to collaborate together. Product saying, hey, these are the journeys, and let me show you it. And then engineers like, oh, okay, I know these endpoints I need to string together to make this into a trace. Or, oh, hey, I need to go off and hit this and measure this specific thing in order for me to say this is available or not. This is the hardware that's associated with it or some other, the containers or the cluster, whatever. They're responsible for achieving it and hooking up the telemetry. Since we're talking about people here a little bit, I also want to bring up this also the third team, which is generally like the business. They generally are presented by like leadership or some larger like overarching viewpoint, but that's responsible for the service. The service needs to be profitable, it needs to be successful, it needs to provide a good experience, whatever. But they also can make more structural changes towards reliability as well. Especially if you talk about you have a dependency on a vendor or something like that as part of this journey, they can help with those different conversations that, in my mind, outside the realm of like product engineering.
I'm reminded of the fact that a lot of applications are reliant on some external provider for identity or, name resolution
Yep.
perhaps. And if that external provider goes down, violates their SLA to the customer, then that can blow up your SLOs pretty quickly.
Oh, completely. So like this is where like I love having, let's call it like global SLOs for service, around like a whole end-to-end user journey and then maybe some segments of it. But then there's also like key dependencies. You also need SLOs around key dependencies of those as well. Such as let's say you outsource your authentication or something. You need to go off and make sure, oh, hey, is our vendor able to meet our reliability needs there? So you can just go off and measure all requests going back and forth to that gateway or to that provider and saying, hey, are we getting good things or bad? And maybe a good response is, hey, unauthorized, and that's okay because someone messed up their auth or the session expired.
Mhm.
And this is where you have to have a good idea of what is good, what is success, and sometimes an error is a success that's actually being returned correctly. I guess this is the difference between like a 400 versus a 500. If they're down versus it's just you gave us bad data, totally different scenarios there.
So I'm thinking of you might come up with SLOs initially. Like you had your meeting with the product team, and these are the three most important things that they have today. And then in 6 months, they introduce a new feature, and that has become the killer feature. And so now your SLOs probably need to shift. But how do you keep that sort of historical backlog of being able to compare apples to apples when the application evolves and so do the SLOs associated with it?
Great point. I love saying SLOs are living, breathing ideas. They're our best guess or best effort of how to measure customer user expectation. As we ship in new features or make changes to ones, your reliability expectations should change as well. Something I love recommending is for folks to have their SLO definitions documented in like some type of YAML file and then have the reasons why they put those in place in Markdown.
Mm.
Some key things I like to recommend here are OpenSLO, which is like an open SLO spec in which people can adopt, and it works with a bunch of different vendors there to go off and have your SLO definitions codified. And then something else, another project I was involved in was SlowDLC. That's slowdlc.com, and I think it's openslow.com as well. We'll put links in the description. I'm saying that as if I work for you guys, but
Oh, we definitely will. No worries.
but OpenSLO as well is more so like markdown files describe like the who, what, when, where of SLO's existence. Like it's something I love to bring up here. Like, hey, SLOs at the end of the day are kind of like a very dashboardy tool. The tools have a bunch of graphs and charts that provide high value signals to people, and you need to be able to read and interpret them correctly. Listeners out there, how many times have you inherited a service from another team? When you inherited that service, did you also receive a dashboard to go along with it? Did you also receive 3 or 5 dashboards to go along with that service when you inherited it? Like this is where like you have too many signals, you don't know what's good or what's not, or even the things that are here, are they even still valid? And this is why having companion documentation to go along with your dashboards, with your metrics, to go off and say, here's why we made these decisions at this time. And one more point there is something that I think a lot of people miss is setting like an expiration date on this documentation and on these services and so forth to actually say, we should go back and revisit these things. Even if it's like just an exercise that, oh, hey, I'm on a spreadsheet, I need to get off it. Yes. It still gives people the opportunity to go back and say, yes, these metrics are still important. Yes, these are still valuable. Versus something that a lot of teams don't do. And it's just something that's not culturally there. It's just, oh, hey, I made the dashboard and that's it, ship it and forget it. Versus actually engaging with the data and having like a week to week, month to month, year to year, or quarter to quarter basis of understanding how our customers are doing and what kind of service we're providing to them. At the end of the day, it's all got to get back to the customer.
As you're talking about this stuff, I'm trying to imagine, how do I implement these SLOs? How do I measure all of this stuff? And is this at the infrastructure level? Like, am I measuring ALB outputs and metrics, or am I measuring the application, like calls and database calls and stuff like that? Or how do you do this? Like, what team owns it? And how is it implemented in practice? That might be a very big question.
That is a big question. I think the answer is just yes. You have to do a bunch of those different things. Essentially, what we're talking about here is what makes a good SLI. And to tell you the truth, that's a very hard question to answer because it really depends so much on what your service is and how it's implemented and architected together. If I was to break it up into like 3 different categories, I would break it up into, you have SLIs or SLOs around customer user experience. These are things like application metrics, maybe stuff for front end, maybe client device kind of monitoring there somewhat to actually see how things are performing there a bit. Then I think you want to have some SLIs around supporting services. So this is stuff like infrastructure metrics, but I think is like a lot of the stuff you kind of mentioned there, like database load times, stuff like that. Maybe are containers running or my clusters up, stuff like that. Think Kubernetes healthy stuff. Then there's also like network metrics, which is stuff more like how well is our internet activity going, or is our load balancer working appropriately? And then also, like I mentioned before a little bit about like SaaS monitoring, hey, we have this dependency on this other product or application to be successful. We need to measure that successfully, and then I think like the third category of like what makes a good SLIs or kind of stuff that's more around reputation and management kind of activity or business stuff. These could be like business KPIs that exist. These could be things around public sentiment or social interaction. If you're on, what are we calling it now, X, and your company's getting added a bunch and you're getting a bunch of hashtags on there, maybe things are going great, maybe things are going terrible, but at least you have some idea of like some type of sentiment of how well you're performing there. Lastly, this one might be a little bit controversial, but maybe also competitive benchmarking. Let's say you're in a certain industry, like maybe the entertainment industry, that is very competitive around technology for, let's call it, streaming things. Maybe you want to measure how your competitors are doing so you're aware of different things that you have to hit as well, because that's what the market's expectations are of your type of service and of your industry.
Interesting. And so it's not even just, are you measuring the infrastructure or the application? It's yes, first of all, and also all of your dependencies, and maybe also your competitors, and maybe also the internet. It just sounds like this is such an enormous discipline. I can see how your math background would marry so well with this because you tend to get trained on working with just tremendously large data sets, which it sounds like you are going to have because of the breadth of what you are monitoring here to put together a cohesive picture. And so this might be a how do you do your job in 60 seconds or less, but how do you make a cohesive map with that tremendous waterfall of data?
This is where it gets back to what is important for you to measure at that time. All those things I just listed, no one has to do all of those. You don't need to do all of those. Not everybody does, not everybody should. And this is where you have matched the expectations of your business and what you need to do. Should you generally have application metrics? Sure. Do you need front end metrics if you just have like a CLI tool? Probably not. It all depends on what you're doing and what needs to be implemented there. It does really depend. And I don't think there is a right or a wrong answer there.
I keep thinking of like cap theorem or like, was it fast, cheap, and good and pick two sort of situation? Like we're back in that territory. And part of that's just driven by what's actually important to the business.
Yeah.
You got to go back. You got to talk to the people who are creating those KPIs that you're talking about. You got to go back and talk to the product team and be like, how does this service drive revenue? And what do the people consuming this service actually care about? And focus on those things first and whatever makes that number go up. Everything else is kind of to the side. It needs to work, but maybe it doesn't need to work at the same level of reliability or the same scale. It's okay if like your time card system is a little slower on one given day, but your checkout system, maybe that always needs to be very performant. I don't know.
And this is where like different services have different expectations around it and how much they need to work and so forth. Like if the time card system's down and you have a 9 to 5 business, it doesn't have to be up on the holidays. It doesn't have to be up when people aren't in the office. So it doesn't really matter. Versus if you're a global e-commerce website, checkout should be running pretty frequently. What's more so like a problem is when service starts to degrade and so forth a bit, and that's where things get a little bit more interested, where you have some failures, but not all the time. Like very rarely are failures like sawtooth kind of pattern. Maybe we can put a graphic up on the screen or something. But generally, it's much more like a slow degradation of you start burning more error budget. SLI studies starting to increase because of some other thing that has backlogged or some other process is starting to be overloaded. It has a dependency on it. So it just really depends there a bit. And I kind of want to go back to Kyler's question a little bit around like dependencies and mapping, because I kind of thought about something else there a bit. Something I love coaching people around is thinking about when you're starting to instrument a service, when you're starting to think about a service's reliability, think about it in the level 9s in which it needs to be responsive and available. Once you have that, you can start thinking, hey, what do we need to do in order to support this? And there's like an open source tool and community I'm involved with called r9y.dev. It's supposed to be reliability.dev, but everyone likes shortening stuff to shorter numbers. And apparently reliability is a hard word to spell. I might have spelled it wrong in a couple CFPs I've submitted, and had some proofreading done. Like r9y.dev is like a map and saying it's a bit opinionated by some folks over at Google of, hey, in order to hit certain level of 9s, here are some things you should have, whether it's development or infrastructure-based things or testing stuff or observability and incident management. But then there's also like one last one as well, which people generally miss, culture. What culture do you need to have in place in order to support these social technical systems? I think they label it as people operations or something like that there. So highly recommend that resource for people to check it out and get involved. It's Could you hit certain levels of balance without doing all those things there? Yeah. But it's generally like a good guide for people who need to think, hey, my service needs to be X reliable. What should I be doing? Or, hey, I'm only this reliable. What do I need in order to get there? What am I missing? It's like kind of a way to check things off there a bit.
This has been such a broad ranging, wonderful conversation, but I'm going to try to close it out with the last question, and hopefully it's a good one. Among the past few interviews we've done, we have gotten a lot of those answers that it totally depends among technology hiring, platform engineering, deep medical device engineering, that it doesn't matter that it's perfect. It doesn't matter that it's good. It matters, does it reflect the needs of the business? And so, say I'm starting out, this is a segue a little in this space as an SRE, or I'm trying to implement SLOs in my company. What's the first thing that I should do? What's the important foundation to build from?
KYC, know your customer, know your product, know your service. You got to know that, and then everything else will follow. Maybe I'm biased in saying observability, but if you don't have a product yet, you don't need observability. If you have a customer, you have some demand, like go create a product. If you have a product, you don't have a customer, go find the market. After that, then go off and start doing things with observability or something else there, or making it super redundant. I read this book about it. It's about like starting small and like you have to start up and getting like a baseline MVP. Oh gosh, what's that book called now? I'm gonna like hate myself. I can't recall.
There's a From Zero to One, Peter Thielen book.
No. All right, we'll cut that part. Yeah, cut that out. Make me sound a little bit smarter. I remember what the book told me, but I don't remember what it's called or who wrote it. But I don't know. Maybe leave it in too. Everyone's imperfect. Maybe that was an error budget. Hey.
That's wonderful. If I want to hear more from you or someone in our audience does, where can they find you on that big, broad internet?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Salvatore Furino. You can find me there. I think I'm just S Furino on there as well. I'm S Furino on most socials if you want to find me on those. On X, I wanted to call it something else, but I can't anymore. I'm also on Blue Sky and Mastodon as well, the Hackadermy instance as well. Everyone can find me and at me there. I just want to also clarify, thoughts and opinions expressed on social media are my own and don't necessarily represent those of my employer.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sal, for appearing on our show today on Day 2 Cloud, and virtual high fives to all of you for tuning in. If you have suggestions for future shows, we'd love to hear them. You can find us on the podcast on LinkedIn or use the feedback form at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU's for follow-up. Get your mind out of the gutter. You can find me, Kyler Middleton, blogging over on Medium, and my stupendous co-host, Ned Ballavance at nedinthecloud.com. And we're both active on LinkedIn. Stop by and say hello. If you like engineering-oriented shows like this one, visit packetpushers.net/subscribe. All our podcasts, newsletters, and websites are there. It's all nerdy content designed for your professional career development. Did you know that you don't have to scream into the technology void alone? The Packet Pushers Podcast Network has a free Slack group open to everyone. Visit packetpushers.net/Slack and join in. It's a marketing-free zone for engineers to chat, compare notes, tell war stories, and solve problems together. packetpushers.net/Slack. If you've got a way cool product that you'd like to share with our audience, especially if it's cloud related, of IT professionals, become a Day 2 Cloud sponsor. You'll reach several thousand listeners, all of whom have problems to solve. Maybe your product fixes their problem. We'll never know unless you tell them about your amazing solution. Find out more at packetpushers.net/sponsorship. Until next time, just remember, cloud is what happens while IT is making other plans.